Hey guys, I can't wait for you to hear this amazing conversation we just had on Authentic Moments. We talked to Kathryn Hubert, owner of Chez Genese restaurant, Liz Kiser, a team member at Chez Genese, and Kelly Graves, the executive director of the Kellin Foundation. We opened up and had a frank conversation about non-visible disabilities. So join us for this authentic conversation. Today, we are discussing invisible disabilities and the impacts they have on our personal and professional lives, how they enrich our lives as well. So I'm so happy to be having this conversation with all of you. So Kelly, first and foremost, we mentioned invisible disabilities or non-visible disabilities. We've heard this terminology, but for our listeners that don't know, can you tell us what does it mean when we mention non-visible disabilities?
Sure. So, we use the term invisible, non-visible, non-apparent, hidden, and these really refer to any mental or emotional or physical condition that goes largely unnoticed by being able to see it just with the naked eye. And this can include things like depression and anxiety, PTSD, autism, chronic pain, and lots of other things. It can impact our bodies and our minds, and so sometimes we use the phrase neurodiversity as well, meaning that the ways that our brains work can be very diverse and very different. And of course we don't necessarily see externally how our brains are working, so those kinds of processes are largely kind of invisible or hidden and can go unnoticed.
And actually, the CDC estimates that approximately 26% of the population lives with a disability, including non-apparent or non-visible ones. That's 1 in 4 people. And what I think is unique, especially considering some of the things that you've mentioned, some of the examples that you've given, it's what's unique about this particular minority group is that any one of us could find ourselves entering at any time, whether that be temporary or permanent, that we could enter in and out of that group. What would you say, Kelly, is kind of the more common? You mentioned some examples. What are some of the more common things that you see?
Well, depression and anxiety are very, very common in our community, and they have increased since COVID in particular. The numbers have really skyrocketed in terms of the number of emotional and mental health conditions that people are struggling with. But PTSD is also one that is higher than the general public would want to think about. The exposure to adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress has increased the PTSD rates across the community. And of course, COVID confounding that and the impacts that COVID has had on so many people. And I think for many, the fact that everyone experienced COVID, even though we all experienced it differently, I think while nobody, of course, wanted COVID to happen, I do think that one of the positive things that has come out of COVID is people being able to understand perhaps at a deeper level the impact that stress can have on our daily lives, and just the peeling back some of the layers where people may not have understood mental health conditions previously, but then experiencing such a major stressor like the pandemic, they may begin to understand that while it's a different stressor than maybe somebody else had, the impacts can be significant on our daily functioning. So I think that that has helped open up and broaden the conversation around mental health and the importance of mental health as a critical part of our overall well-being, not just mental health, but our physical health and our health overall.
I think it's really important what you say too is that certainly there was, COVID was this disruptor that kind of brought this to light. Maybe it increased the prevalence of things like certain mental health diagnoses like depression or anxiety, but it opened a conversation as well that maybe we haven't had, because certainly we bring whatever we are experiencing that is a part of us, and we bring that into our personal relationships and in our professional relationships. But I think it's interesting that only about, I was reading that only about 3.2% of employees actually disclose their disability to their employer. So I'd love to talk about how do, especially when you think about non-visible disabilities, non-apparent disabilities, how might that impact or show up in our personal and professional lives?
I think what you've just stated is incredibly important, and I love the word that you heard that you used, like that. COVID was a disruptor, because I am hoping that the conversations like we're having today disrupt the silence around what it means to live with an invisible disability or a mental health condition. There can often be a lot of stigma around mental health in particular compared to other chronic health conditions. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people are hesitant to talk about and share what they're struggling with, is just the stigma around that. And we know that it can be stronger across different cultures. Some cultures, having a mental health condition carries more stigma than others. And so when we think about um, community health and wellness, we also have to factor in that there's cultural differences in comfort levels and people talking about invisible disabilities like mental health or emotional wellness. And I think there's still room to grow among our employees and employer bases around the fact that having a mental health condition or an invisible disability does not mean that they can't perform a job and perform it well. It means just like we might have people on our staff that have diabetes or high blood pressure or other health conditions, that they're managing those conditions while they're doing a great job on at work. And so the more we can have conversations like this that recognize that a mental health condition is not any different than a physical health condition in terms of a person's focus on managing that particular condition, I think the more people will be comfortable talking about it in the workplace and in the community.
For sure. And I too, I hope that this conversation, I hope that it continues. I hope that it helps to kind of break down some of those. So, Kathryn, you definitely, you certainly have some exposure, some thoughts here, I'm sure. Being that this is working with and employing people who might have various intellectual disabilities, like that's obviously a part of your mission. Can you add any insight to that? How do you see these different um, disabilities impacting or showing up in our professional lives?
I think in terms of our business, our goal is to provide equality amongst our team. About 50% of our staff have intellectual or developmental disabilities, so we're striving for an integrated work model, because we believe that there's so much benefit in having neurodiversity on our staff and us getting to learn and grow together. There's so much of my own life and story that is woven into the business concept of Chez Genese that it honestly would be hard to give you that full picture in the form of this meeting and this podcast today. But a handful or a sprinkling of those things are that I've always loved food. So that's the profession that I have pursued. I have a degree in culinary. I studied hospitality management. I lived in France for a year about 15 years ago and fell in love with the way the French view food and hospitality. I have three cousins with autism, so have grown up with autism in my family. My own personal experience, I grew up, I think, a lot of times feeling somewhat left out of the groups or the friends that I wanted to be a part of. And so the drive that I have for creating spaces where people can belong and feel welcomed is very personal to some of my own wounds and hurts that I experienced growing up. And then I also was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was 16. And so worked through having an anxiety disorder and was at that point in my life where I felt like I would never get to pursue the things that I wanted to in my life and get to actually do what I wanted to with my life. And there were a lot of people who came around me and believed a different story for me, and helped actually equip me to step forward um, into that. So that, I think, there's logistics in my life that have led to the overall business concept. The heartbeat behind it really comes from this personal place of wanting to create a place for people to belong and to feel accepted. And I see so much injustice in our world around individuals with disabilities, the discrimination that they face, the lack of opportunities that are available, and wanting to not only change the way that our culture views disabilities, but also to create a shift within the friends and the teammates that I have with disabilities for them to believe different stories for themselves than the narratives they've been told.
And Kathryn, I absolutely love that you said that, particularly the like the difference between the the focus not just on diversity, because diversity is critically important. I think we can all agree on that. But like, I love that you're extending that to inclusion. So it's not just that we're hiring people that have, and we're working with people that have different ability levels, but we're focusing on that sense of community and belonging and everyone, working together, which I think is like the secret sauce. Diversity, having a diverse team is essential, but not sufficient. Like there's more to it, and I love that you all are focusing on the inclusion piece along with the diversity piece.
And I think that's part of why that question of like, what does it mean to show up professionally or personally with a disability? Part of that is because baseline, we're human, and that's the goal among our team, is to see each person as an individual and as a human. And so it's like each person, disability or not, shows up in the world differently, has different goals, has different passions, has different stressors, has different skills. Like they all bring something different to the table. So to isolate it down simply to the disability eliminates so much of who someone is as an individual. I don't think that's fair to them. Like, I think that's such a partial part of the conversation, when what I want us to do as a team and as part of our community is to care about each human individually and get to know them. What do you want to do? What are your goals? What are the things that excite you? What are the things that make you afraid? And actually push each person into their potential, and also celebrate them for who they are. And I think disability is part of that, but we can sometimes, culturally, it's like we either don't talk about the disability at all, or we only talk about the disability, and both of those options does someone with the disability a disservice.
I think that's one of the really neat points about creating a compassionate community, in terms of, this is what you all are seeing in the restaurant. And the unfortunate part is that there's so many in the community that don't have that same perspective, and that's where some of the the additional disabilities or different impacts can come into play, in terms of beginning to develop that depression and anxiety because of some of the stress and strain of perhaps having an autism diagnosis, or being neurodiverse, that the community doesn't always embrace in the same way, which can create some additional stressors on that person. And so I think that unfortunately, the more we can get the community to embrace neurodiversity and invisible disabilities, and kind of come at it from that mindset, the less we'll need those mental health treatment services in the community as well.
And I definitely think you bring out something really, both of you are bringing out something really important in that um, that we all have a combination of identities and experiences that makes each of us unique. And if we're lucky, we get to show up as all of that at work. Not always, but if we're lucky, we get to. And I think that's one of the really special things about Chez Genese is that you're creating, with your kind of integrated model, you're creating a space where people who might, part of their identity might include a intellectual disability, or people who don't have that particular experience get to learn from and understand one another. So I really love that about the model. And I'm so glad that we have Liz here, who I know works at Chez Genese, and I know that that you probably have some great things to tell us about your experience. But Liz, I would love to know a little bit about what it's like working at Chez Genese. How long have you been there, first of all, and what do you do?
Um, so I started out as a server when I first started working at Chez Genese. I had never worked in the restaurant and hospitality industry before this job. I think most of our team, there's only one other staff member that had worked in the restaurant and hospitality industry before Chez Genese. And so I really got to learn how to serve tables for the first time. And a little bit about my story is I actually have an auditory processing disorder, and I also have some PTSD from some childhood trauma. And so I knew a little bit about my disability, but I didn't actually learn about it until college. It was one of those things like Kathryn was saying, like that my parents didn't talk about, and there was so much shame and a narrative that I started to believe about myself, that I wasn't smart, that I wasn't capable, and that left me kind of hopeless. And as I started learning more about auditory processing disorder, um, which for those of you that don't know about it, and the way that it impacts my life is that I like to refer to it as being partially brain deaf. So I hear everything fine through my ears, but when it gets to my brain jumbles it all up. And so I only receive about 50 to 60% of what's being told to me verbally. And so a lot of times my response would be like, "What? Can you say that one more time?" Or I didn't realize until COVID how much I rely on reading lips to actually get some of that information. Um, I I started to realize how exhausted I was trying to engage in conversation with people because I didn't have the capacity to read their lips, and I was relying heavily on just listening. And so it's really important for me to have verbal or like stuff written down for me, or even when I watch movies with my friends, like I'll have the captions on the screens so I can take in information through my eyes too. So when I started learning more about auditory processing disorder before working at Chez Genese, I was like, there's no way that I could be a server. There's so much noise going on. Like, and that was another thing, like when I go to concerts or parties, it's really hard for me to engage in conversation because I pick up on all of the background noise. And so I was like, there's no way that I'm going to be able to be a server. And I just had that mindset that I couldn't do it. And, but I did it. I tried it. I like trying new things and pushing myself um, in that. And Kathryn believed in me. And I worked, and then I love serving. I learned to really love the job and actually enjoyed it. I felt like I was good at it, and so there's a sense of like accomplishment that I felt that I never had really experienced before. Because in school, I was always just trying to stay above water. I It was one of those things that I was shameful of because there weren't conversations behind it. I felt very alone because I'd never heard someone talk about it before, and was trying to figure it all out on my own. And so I think that, um, yeah, I think that over time working at Chez Genese, I've just learned how to kind of rewrite that narrative and flip it on its head and realize that I can actually do things, and I do have a skill set to bring, and that there's hope for a future. So I don't know if I went on a tangent there, but that's a little bit about my story, and what I bring. I'm really passionate um, about encouraging my staff or the staff on our team and learning more about their stories because I didn't believe in myself, and didn't believe that I could do something, and having people around me um, to believe in me, like I want to do that for other people because I got that some, but it was a lot of me just trying to figure it out on my own, and I don't want people to experience that.
So, Kelly, I know that your foundation works with people um, who have a number of non-apparent disabilities, intellectual disabilities, with mental health. Can you talk to us about the Kellin Foundation and what you do to help those who may experience the world with an invisible disability?
Sure. So we are a behavioral health agency. That's kind of our base, but we do a lot of work to raise awareness about mental health conditions and non-visible types of conditions in the community. And then we also do a lot to treat. So we focus on prevention, treatment, and healing. And so we do navigation of service systems because the systems can be quite complicated to navigate as people need to access different types of services. So we assist individuals with navigating the system, getting access to resources that they need access to. We also do clinical treatment. So we implement evidence based treatments to address mental health, different mental health conditions, and have multiple specialty clinics to provide services across the lifespan. And then, last, which I think is critically important, is we have a whole team of peer support specialists, which for those that may not be familiar with that, these are individuals that have lived experience with various mental health conditions or substance use conditions that are all in recovery. They're all managing their symptoms and in working environments and working here as employees here. But the goal is really for those individuals to connect with people who are struggling with those same symptoms, to walk alongside them, provide support, provide information, because it's helpful to have kind of the treatment piece, but it's also really helpful to talk to somebody that's been there and has experienced similar things. While they might be different, there's some overlapping experiences that people can share.
That's fantastic. I love the peer support model. I think that's a super important a part of what you do. Certainly, your services, as you mentioned, are wraparound, but that's such a unique,
Yeah.
I think, an important part of the service delivery, providing that support from, being able to have support from someone who has the same
Hmm.
experience, who may have already been there. That's really
Yeah.
special.
I often think about it like, if you've had a baby, sometimes when you've had a baby, there are things that happen with the infant and you want to call your pediatrician and get their advice on that. But then there's sometimes you just want to call a friend or another mom or your mom or an aunt or whatever, just to kind of, talk about, like, this is happening. Did this happen when, I was growing up or with other babies that you know? So it's a different type of support and both essentially important.
I would love to hear from you all since you have all of have this experience. How do you think that when you think about coworkers, employers, I think you kind of touched on this a bit, Kathryn, but how do you think we can do a better job of supporting people in their individuality in general, but specifically people that have a non-visible disability and intellectual disability, might be experiencing a mental health diagnosis? How do you think we can do better to as employers, as coworkers, to support people in that way?
Yeah, I think that I think there's a lot of different reasons, but I'll focus on a couple of them. One, as an employer, we have been talking a lot here recently about the difference between equality and exceptionalism. And something that I see a lot of times in disability employment is that the person with the disability is treated as the exception to the rule. So here's the standard or here's the process, but the person with the disability, it's oftentimes lowered for that person. And a lot of times not because the person has asked for that either. It's just, I think a lot of mindset culturally still takes pity on people with disabilities instead of viewing them as equal humans. And so there's a lot of just natural, I'm going to step in and help you when that isn't necessarily something that's being asked or solicited for. So that has been like, and still is, a constant reworking process in my own brain and challenging my own thoughts and way of seeing things. Like a good example of that is one of my employees the other day who's on the shorter side but was bringing out a bunch of cheese boards to put up on our expo window, and he also has Down syndrome. I just like, my first instinct was to go and like reach for the boards and put them away for him, and I had to actually like consciously think about it and stand back and see if he could do it himself first. And he could do it. He just stood on his tiptoes and he slid them back, and he didn't ask for help. He didn't need it, but I was going to step in and just do it for him when that wasn't what was needed and that wasn't what was being asked of me either. And so challenging my own perception in that, but also trying to hold a company-wide standard and policy in terms of this is what I expect from my staff, disability or not. And if someone needs an accommodation or an adaptation made in order to successfully meet that standard, then we work with that. And we like to make adaptations to systems and processes in order to make sure that each person can be successful and productive in their jobs, but we're not changing the standard. And so I think that's one area as an employer, is making sure that your standards are equal across the board, and that you're treating staff equally within that.
Industries are different. People's businesses are different, but employers, particularly those that are in helping professions and first responders and essential workers and things, I think it's really important that we also talk about the fact that individuals in the workforce, depending on industry, may experience some secondary stress, some secondary trauma based on the work that they're doing, from healthcare to first responders to counseling and mental health professions to nurses to et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes we don't pause to recognize the impact that our work can have on us. And I think, as we build a wellness culture in the work environment, that's a critical conversation to keep at the forefront, is not only how are we helping the people around us, but how are we making sure that in that process, we're monitoring the impact that our work is having on us. And I think that's a critical component and conversation that should happen in the workplace.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you mentioned there, certainly I think mental health days are important. One of the things that you mentioned there is that we really need to focus on building, communication peer to peer, building those relationships, and from the lens of us just being human. I think that's so important when we think about what can we do as individual coworkers within this system. I think you're absolutely right. That alone, just approaching one another with a sense of humanity is super important. Also, Kathryn, I really like what you said about this, about thinking that we need to help people. So when people do disclose that they have a disability, and then we see it as this exception, this pull out that we have to provide some specific help. I love that you highlight that, because really what that says to me, and what you are doing with your company, is creating a space where people are received as individuals who all have something to share. And so it might be that in order for me to, I can do this job, but in order for me to do this job, I need quiet. Uh, or, I work better in a bright space. If we're thinking about that, we all come to this with our own um, particular abilities and the things, that resources that we need to help us thrive. I think that's probably a way in which all of us, all of our organizations, should be interrogating ourselves about how can we do that more, rather than treating a particular intellectual disability as an exception. Thank you for listening to Authentic Moments. To hear more episodes and receive information about our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at Cone Health, click the link to visit our SharePoint site.